All right. So for now, our talk today is going to be, I'm really excited for this, David, 5 Reasons Nietzsche Still Matters by David. Unmute yourself and join me in giving him a warm round of applause.
Thanks for that warm welcome. Yeah, I'm here, and had a little bit of technical difficulty at first, but yeah. So we're actually going to start with a meme, and I hope this works. So let's do the share screen thing. And if you can't see the screen for whatever reason, it is a image of Nietzsche with the ridiculously big mustache, and there's the quote, "God is dead," Friedrich Nietzsche, 1883. And then that's followed by a picture of God, apparently, the version of Michelangelo's God in the Sistine Chapel, saying, "Nietzsche is dead, God, 1900. And I start with this meme today because, this "God is dead" is the slogan for which Nietzsche is perhaps best well known. Such familiarity is reflected there in that meme. And it seems to be trying to decisively refute Nietzsche and giving God the last word on just who is dead after all. The strange thing about it is that it seems to miss the meaning of this event of the death of God for Nietzsche. It's not an unambiguously positive thing for him. It's not as if Nietzsche is trying to kill off God prematurely. Nietzsche sees it as the actions of the past several generations of people leading up to him, mostly people's fixation on money and economic activity, that have made God and spiritual matters largely irrelevant. For Nietzsche, this vacuum in people's moral center is contributing to an era of nihilism in which nothing really means anything any longer and no one believes in anything anymore. Much of his work is in actually trying to assess in a really critical manner, a drastically and radically critical manner, this era of nihilism, to find out just how deep this rabbit hole goes, and perhaps to find a way out. Even though as atheists today, we're probably less fearful about the possible consequences of a lack of God in public life than Nietzsche was. In fact, I would guess many of us have arrived at the position that it's the never-ending corrosive battles over whose God is better, witness what's currently happening in Afghanistan, that causes more problems than God is worth. But Nietzsche still seems a key figure in the development of atheism, and it's for this reason that I proposed his philosophy as a focus for this afternoon. Nietzsche occupies a really unique position in United States pop culture. Given a random list of philosophers, I'd guess he's near the top in name recognition. Many people have heard of him and think they know what he's about, but that very familiarity can also create a problem of its own, namely a greater opportunity for misunderstanding or reductive and simplistic stereotypes. A pretty basic misunderstanding is thinking of him as a purely a might makes right type of thinker. This attitude is reflected in another meme. Let me show you that one. This meme explains the history of philosophy through donuts, which I really appreciate. I love this idea of retelling the history of philosophy through donuts. I want to believe, but I really don't see a fair summary of Nietzsche's ideas. Let me scroll down so you can see the Nietzsche part of this as, to stop at nothing to get whatever one wants, a kind of by any means necessary approach with implied violence. I think a fairer application of Nietzsche's ideas in donut terms might go something like, don't be satisfied with crappy, substandard, mass-produced donuts. Instead, try to imagine the best damn donut that you can, an Uber donut, if you will, a donut that creates such a transformative experience in us that we might not even recognize it as a donut any longer. Strive for that kind of donut. Perhaps the funniest version of this might makes right Nietzsche fanboy stereotype comes in the person of a character played by Kevin Kline in the 1988 movie A Fish Called Wanda, Otto West, a sadistic but comically stupid, intellectually pretentious hitman and ex-CIA arms dealer who loves the idea of not being bound by norms of human feeling, probably because he's a psychopath. The general douchiness of the West character and other such real-life people pretty much single-handedly killed any sort of nascent interest I may have had in Nietzsche as a teenager, which raises a really interesting question, I think. Is it fair to judge a philosopher by the sort of people who take up their mantle later on after their deaths? His philosophy has influenced many varied people, such as Hitler and white supremacists, Ayn Rand, the German sociologist Max Weber, existentialists, the post-structuralists Derrida, Deleuze, and Foucault, and Marxist or critical theorists Adorno and Benjamin. So there's a wide array of fascists and anti-fascists. Speaking from a purely personal perspective, as someone with democratic socialist ideals, it can be a difficult experience to read his work, actually. Why bother when he seems bound and determined to call into question in the most radical fashion all values I hold most dear, such as democracy, greater economic equality, feminism, science, etc.? When he discusses what he calls the slave morality of ancient Jewish people, it's really difficult not to see that as anti-Semitic, even though he broke off his personal friendship with the composer Wagner for just such ideological differences, and he refused to attend his sister Elizabeth's wedding to a guy named Bernhard Förster, who was a notorious white nationalist and anti-Semite. It might be worth mentioning that Nietzsche writes in an intentionally provocative way, so that it can be difficult to know what he really thought. With his tendencies toward aristocratic authoritarianism, though, he leaves us a complicated legacy, but it's a legacy that's difficult to ignore. Along with Marx and Freud, philosopher Paul Ricoeur, for example, labeled Nietzsche as one of the three core masters of the hermeneutics of suspicion, the idea that the surface-level meaning of text should not be trusted. This intellectual triumvirate, perhaps also adding in Darwin, Einstein, and the Swiss linguist Saussure, largely set the parameters of intellectual life in the 20th century. Good Without God author and humanist chaplain at Harvard, Greg Epstein, captures this sense of ambiguity well. He writes, "He cannot be entirely absolved for the fact that some of his statements suggest, whether he meant them to or not, that the strong and fortunate have no moral obligation to the weak and powerless." Hitler and the Nazis took Nietzsche's work out of context and bastardized its meaning, but that is hardly high praise. In the end, his contribution to humanist thought was mixed, but we can take from it his passionate insistence that any form of goodness must come without God, and any meaning our lives are to have must be a meaning we create. I think it's precisely because of this complicated and difficult legacy that we ought to see what's worth salvaging from his body of work, especially because he is such an early voice of atheism and a pretty severe critic of Christianity. So that's the job that I've sort of laid out for myself today. By the way, I should mention that I am not approaching his work as an uncritical disciple here. I see this paper more as a kind of impetus for further thinking and reading on one's own. This talk is also not going to be an introductory survey or biographical report of Nietzsche. If that's what you're looking for, I may recommend the Wikipedia article about him, or perhaps a bit more comprehensive, the article on him in the Stanford Online Philosophy Encyclopedia is good. What I plan to do here today instead is to pick out 5 ideas from his work that I think have a continuing relevance. And then for each of these ideas, I've picked out some quotes from his work that I'll read and then spend a bit of time trying to unpack. I feel somewhat justified in this rather eclectic choice of method because Nietzsche is not himself a very systematic thinker. As he wrote in his book, The Twilight of the Idols, the will to a system is a lack of integrity. One of the ways this suspicion towards systematic thinking manifested itself in his work was his frequent use of aphorisms, which are relatively brief and concentrated bursts of thought, apparently disconnected from one another. In his books, he rarely achieves a quality of coherent progression in an extended way. He might have preferred this form because it allowed him to experiment with a variety of different ideas and rhetorical stances. In this, I think he would have rather liked the environment of status updates on social media. As one of his many biographers, Sue Prideaux, writes, Nietzsche is an unusual philosopher because he doesn't tell us what to think. The 5 ideas that I've decided to focus on are perhaps not as most important. They are just the 5 that I happen to find the most interesting in a contingent way today. So here they are. 1, maintaining a sense of intellectual curiosity in a cultural context not conducive to a life of the mind. 2, our notion of value, why we think something's important, should not be reduced down to a simplistic notion of money or baseline utility alone. 3, interpretation is more important than objective facts or truth. 4, our understanding of individual agency is complicated by a deconstruction of patterns of cause and effect thinking associated with a conventional sense of the subject, the I. And lastly, process matters. Becoming may be more important to think about than being. So the first reason that I think Nietzsche still matters, the importance of maintaining a sense of intellectual curiosity, was inspired by yet another meme that Bruce Lehrer reposted a few weeks ago on the Seattle Atheist Church page. Let me share that with you briefly here. So it's a picture of Isaac Asimov, the great science fiction writer. Anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. Along these same lines, historian Richard Hofstadter wrote an entire book on this trend throughout U.S. history, published back in the 60s, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. Hofstadter described this as a resentment of the life of the mind and those who are considered to represent it, and a disposition to constantly minimize the value of that life. I want to come back to this problem of resentment because it seems to cut both ways, I think. Here's the quote from Nietzsche, which is the second aphorism from his book called The Gay Science. And it's on the longish side, so sorry about that. Bear with me here. The intellectual conscience. I keep having the same experience and keep resisting it every time. I do not want to believe it, although it is palpable. The great majority of people lacks an intellectual conscience. Indeed, it has often seemed to me as if anyone calling for an intellectual conscience were as lonely in the most densely populated cities as if they were in a desert. Everybody looks at you with strange eyes and goes right on handling their scales, calling this good and that evil. Nobody even blushes when you intimate that their weights are underweight. Nor do people feel outraged. They merely laugh at your doubts. I mean, the great majority of people does not consider it contemptible to believe this or that and to live accordingly without first having given themselves an account of the final and most certain reasons pro and con, and without even troubling themselves about such reasons afterward. The most gifted men and the noblest women still belong to this great majority. But what is good-heartedness, refinement, or genius to me when the person who has these virtues tolerates slack feelings in their faith and judgments, and when they do not account the desire for uncertainty as their inmost craving and deepest distress, as that which separates the higher human beings from the lower? Among some pious people, I found a hatred of reason and was well disposed toward them for that. For this at least betrayed their bad intellectual conscience. But to stand in the midst of this whole marvelous uncertainty and rich ambiguity of existence without questioning, without trembling with the craving and the rapture of such questioning, without at least hating the person who questions, perhaps even finding him faintly amusing, that is what I feel to be contemptible. And this is the feeling for which I look first in everybody. Some folly keeps persuading me that every human being has this feeling simply because they are human. This is my type of injustice. The importance of Nietzsche's point here, as well as Asimov's and Hofstadter's, I think, should be somewhat obvious in our current pandemic and global climate changing times. It's an attitude that I often face as an adjunct college writing instructor. Asking students to read a frickin' book sometimes seems like an insurmountable hurdle. Reading no longer seems to be a part of the cultural DNA of most young people. And I think it's hard to get around the fact that reading is a primary interface that people might have with an intellectual or academic way of thinking. I risk sounding like cranky old man Balkovin here, I realize, so I try not to sound too judgmental and resentful. I'm trying not to anyway. I mean, it's not as if back in my day, I didn't take plenty of time out for bad TV and other unintellectual pursuits. But these days, it almost seems as if I'm doing something wrong in asking students to make an effort to learn something new. This is where I need to return to Hofstadter's notion of anti-intellectualism as a form of resentment, because I think it's difficult to discuss this without in turn sounding resentful oneself. In this regard, I don't think Nietzsche is a good model, as his writing often reflects this feeling of intellectually entitled isolation and alienation from the dominant culture of his time, which is a form of resentment. It's for this very reason that Hofstadter noted that intellectuals are seen as pretentious, conceited, and snobbish, and very likely immoral, dangerous, and subversive. The plain sense of the common man is an altogether adequate substitute for, if not actually much superior to, former knowledge and expertise. And here we are in the situation where we wonder whether the experts really do have all the answers. I personally don't know of a good way out of this trap. How to value a life of the mind without resorting to the temptation of resentment. This question of value brings me to the second point I want to focus on today. Our sense of value should not be reduced down to a simplistic form of utility. For this point, I'm bringing together three rather disconnected ideas from his books, The Gay Science and The Twilight of the Idols. First, Aphorism 381 from The Gay Science. One does not only wish to be understood when one writes. One wishes just as surely not to be understood. It's not by any means necessarily an objection to a book when anyone finds it impossible to understand. Perhaps that was part of the author's intention. They did not want to be understood by just anybody. In a contradictory way, Nietzsche seems to be implying that a book could be useful to us precisely because we don't understand it and can't put it to use. Similarly, in The Twilight of the Idols, he writes, one misunderstands great human beings if one views them from the paltry perspective of public utility. But one does not know how to make any use of it, perhaps even pertains to greatness. Whenever we try to measure a sense of artistic value in a purely scientific or numbers-based way, we're making a fundamental mistake. Towards the end of Aphorism 373 from The Gay Science, Nietzsche applies this idea to music. Do we really want to admit existence to be reduced to a mere exercise for a calculator and an indoor diversion for mathematicians? Above all, one should not wish to divest existence of its rich ambiguity. An essentially mechanical world would be an essentially meaningless world. Assuming that one estimated the value of a piece of music according to how much of it could be counted, calculated, and expressed in formulas, how absurd would such a scientific estimation of music be? What would one have comprehended, understood, grasped of it? Nothing, really nothing of it. What is music in it? Every week on the news, they broadcast the box office revenues of the various movies playing, but knowing how much money a particular movie happened to bring in doesn't necessarily answer the question of whether the movie is worth seeing in the first place. Okay, awkward transition here. I'm moving on to the third reason I think that Nietzsche still matters. This can be found in a couple different places, such as Aphorism 481 and The Will to Power, but I'm going to actually read from 374 in The Gay Science. And this is also a little bit long, sorry. Our new infinite. How far the perspective character of existence extends, or indeed whether existence has any other character than this, whether existence without interpretation, without sense, does not become nonsense, whether, on the other hand, all existence is not essentially actively engaged in interpretation, that cannot be decided even by the most industrious and most scrupulously conscientious analysis and self-examination of the intellect. For in the course of this analysis, the human intellect cannot avoid seeing itself in its own perspectives, and only in these. We cannot look around our own corner. It is a hopeless curiosity that wants to know what other kinds of intellects and perspectives there might be. For example, whether some beings might be able to experience time backward, or alternately forward and backward, which would involve another direction of life and another concept of cause and effect. But I should think that today we are at least far from the ridiculous immodesty that would be involved in decreeing from our corner that perspectives are permitted only from this corner. Rather, has the world become infinite for us all over again, inasmuch as we cannot reject the possibility that it may include infinite interpretations. Unlike the first two ideas that I focused on today, this third point, which Nietzsche calls perspectivism, I think is one of his core ideas. If interpretation is more important than objective facts or truth, then it leads into an important anti-foundational way of thinking. There are risks to throwing all sense of moral certainty out the window, but it may be worth mentioning that just because everything is interpretation, it does not necessarily lead into a form of subjective relativistic anarchy. Some interpretations may be better than others. It's as a student of literature that I most connect to Nietzsche's idea here. Who has control over a text's meaning? The so-called new criticism, the hegemonic form of academic literary analysis from the 1940s into the 70s, severed the notion of authorial intention from a work's value. From some people's perspective, that's the literary equivalent of taking the dollar off of the gold standard. But rejecting a strict model of authorial intention does not mean that I can make a text mean whatever I like. A good reading has to be based on the text itself. What interpretation can be justified by the text? What can be said to be there? What can we make of the text that helps us understand it better? From Nietzsche's perspective, what makes an interpretation better is if it's life-affirming. Of course, exactly what that means adds to the interpretive difficulty, of course. In the Wikipedia article on Perspectivism, the author notes how Nietzsche takes a more contextualist approach to truth, which rejects any God's eye view of the world. This obviously connects to a focus on atheism that we might want to pursue further. However, Nietzsche's perspectivism itself stands in sharp contrast to any such relativism that may follow from this move. In outlining his perspectivism, Nietzsche rejects those who claim everything to be subjective by disassembling the notion of the subject as itself a mere invention and interpretation. This brings me to the fourth point. Our understanding of individual agency is complicated by a deconstruction of patterns of cause and effect thinking associated with the conventional sense of individual will in the subject. In the 16th and 17th aphorisms from Beyond Good and Evil, for example, Nietzsche really takes apart Descartes' famous idea that I think, therefore I am. You may be familiar with this idea. Nietzsche writes, and this is rather extended too, sorry. There are still harmless self-observers who believe that there are immediate certainties. For example, I think, as though knowledge here got hold of its object purely and nakedly as the thing in itself, without any falsification on the part of either the subject or the object. But that immediate certainty, as well as absolute knowledge in the thing in itself, involve a reduction to the absurd. I shall repeat 100 times, we really ought to free ourselves from the seduction of words. Let the people suppose that knowledge means knowing things entirely. The philosopher must say to himself, when I analyze the process that is expressed in the sentence, I think, I find a whole series of daring assertions that would be difficult, perhaps impossible to prove. For example, that it is I who think, that there must necessarily be something that thinks, that thinking is an activity, an operation on the part of a being who is thought of as a cause, that there is an ego, and finally, that it's already determined what is to be designated by thinking, that I know what thinking is. For if I had not already decided within myself what it is, by what standard could I determine whether that which is just happening is not perhaps willing or feeling? In short, the assertion I think assumes that I compare my state at the present moment with other states of myself, which I know, in order to determine what it is. On account of this retrospective connection with further knowledge, it has, at any rate, no immediate certainty for me. In place of the immediate certainty in which people may believe in the case at hand, the philosopher thus finds a series of metaphysical questions presented to them, truly searching questions of the intellect, to wit, from where do I get the concept of thinking? Why do I believe in cause and effect? What gives me the right to speak of an ego, and even of an ego as cause, and finally of an ego as the cause of thought? Whoever ventures to answer these metaphysical questions at once by an appeal to a sort of intuitive perception, like the person who says, I think and I know that this at least is true, actual, and certain, will encounter a smile and 2 question marks from a philosopher nowadays. Sir, the philosopher will perhaps give them to understand, it's impossible that you are not mistaken, but why insist on the truth? And then on to number 17. With regard to the superstition of logicians, I shall never tire of emphasizing a small terse fact, which these superstitious minds hate to concede, namely, that a thought comes when it wishes and not when I wish, so that it's a falsification of the fake facts of the case to say that the subject I is the condition of the predicate think. It thinks, but that this it is precisely the famous old ego is, to put it mildly, only a supposition, an assertion, and assuredly not an immediate certainty. After all, one has even gone too far with this it thinks. Even the it contains an interpretation of the process and does not belong to the process itself. One infers here, according to the grammatical habit, thinking is an activity. Every activity requires an agent, consequently. This way of thinking about the individual subject, the I, could have far-reaching aspects for criminal liability and notions of responsibility. Unfortunately, time is running short, so let me move on. Breaking down this sense of agency, of separating actor from act, leads into the 5th and final point I wanted to discuss today, which is process matters. Becoming may be more important than being. In aphorism number 715 from Will to Power, Nietzsche writes, linguistic means of expression are useless for expressing becoming. It accords with our inevitable need to preserve ourselves, to posit a crude world of stability, of things, etc. We may venture to speak of atoms and monads in a relative sense, and it is certain that the smallest world is the most durable. So he's saying that our linguistic habit of breaking the world up into nouns and verbs ends up reducing what Nietzsche called, which I earlier quoted, this whole marvelous uncertainty and rich ambiguity of existence. Nietzsche's ideas seem crucial to notions of process thought. I'd really like to explore this further, but as I'm nearing the end of my time to talk, I don't really have the time to fully explore that. If you do want to learn more about that, I would highly recommend a book called The Nick of Time by Elizabeth Gross. She links Nietzsche's alternative way of thinking about process and becoming to Darwin and Bergson. So I don't have much of a conclusion to offer up here. This may be especially appropriate in discussing Nietzsche because he wanted to interrogate any suspiciously simple, goal-oriented, or teleological undertaking. Let me close, though, with another quote from Nietzsche. The worst readers are those who behave like plundering troops. They take away a few things that they can use, dirty and confound the remainder, and revile the whole. It's my hope that I have not done that this afternoon and have instead given us avenues for further thought. Now I welcome any questions or thoughts during our discussion period that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Can I invite everyone to unmute their microphone and give a quick round of applause? Thanks, David.